Emily Carter had never been the type of person to believe in the supernatural. She was a rational thinker, a college student majoring in history, fascinated by facts and real-world mysteries. But on that chilly autumn afternoon, something compelled her to take a detour on her usual route home. It was a Sunday, the kind of day when the city felt eerily silent, with most people indoors enjoying their last moments of rest before the workweek resumed. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, swirling golden and brown fragments around her feet as she walked down an unfamiliar path. She hadn't planned on visiting the cemetery that day. In fact, she had never even set foot in Hollow Oak Cemetery before. It was one of those forgotten places on the outskirts of town, nestled between an abandoned church and a stretch of dense forest that no one seemed to venture into anymore. From a distance, the iron gates looked rusted and unwelcoming, their Gothic patterns twisted with age. Something about the sight of them made her pause. There was a subtle pull in her chest, an inexplicable curiosity that made her push the heavy gate open with a creaking groan. Inside, the air felt colder. The trees that lined the edges of the cemetery were old and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the overcast sky. Gravestones of all shapes and sizes dotted the landscape, some well-maintained with fresh flowers and polished plaques, while others were cracked and covered in moss, forgotten by time. Emily walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe she was just drawn to the quiet solitude of the place, or maybe it was the way the cemetery held stories within its soil, stories of people who once lived, loved, and were eventually left behind. Her eyes drifted over the engraved names on the headstones as she passed them. Some were simple, marking the lives of ordinary people. Others bore elaborate carvings, the final testaments of families who wanted to ensure their loved ones were remembered. And then she saw it, a single, unremarkable gravestone, half hidden by the creeping ivy that had begun to swallow it. There was nothing special about it. No extravagant design, no fresh flowers to indicate someone still cared. But what made Emily stop in her tracks was a photo. It was small, encased in an old, cracked glass frame embedded into the stone. At first, she thought she was mistaken. Perhaps the dim light of the setting sun was playing tricks on her. But as she stepped closer, her breath hitched in her throat. The face staring back at her was her own. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she knelt, wiping away the thin layer of dust covering the plaque beneath the photo. The name inscribed there sent a shiver down her spine. Eleanor Carter, born 1912, died 1936. Carter, her last name. But that wasn't what unsettled her the most. It was the fact that the woman in the photograph looked exactly like her. Not just similar, identical. Same piercing green eyes, same high cheekbones, same unruly waves of dark brown hair. It was as if she were looking at an old photograph of herself, trapped in time. A chill ran down her spine, and for the first time in her life, Emily felt the creeping tendrils of fear take hold. She reached out hesitantly, fingers trembling, and traced the edges of the photo. The glass was ice cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. A gust of wind rustled the trees behind her, sending a cascade of dry leaves skittering across the ground. She glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The rational part of her brain tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe Eleanor Carter had been a distant relative, someone she had never heard of, but whose genes had inexplicably mirrored her own. Maybe, but something inside her whispered otherwise. She needed answers. Emily took out her phone, snapping a quick picture of the grave and the eerie photograph. Then, taking a deep breath, she stood up. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, making everything feel even more surreal. She turned to leave, but just as she took a step away, she heard it, a whisper, low, almost imperceptible, carried by the wind. Emily, she froze. Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, She turned her head, scanning the empty cemetery. There was no one there. The rows of graves remained undisturbed, the air still and heavy. She swallowed hard, convincing herself it was just the wind, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something had changed, and it had all started with that photo on the tombstone. Emily stood frozen in front of the gravestone, her breath caught in her throat. The eerie photograph embedded in the old, cracked glass continued to stare back at her, an uncanny reflection of her own face. The name Eleanor Carter was etched deeply into the weathered stone, its letters worn by time but still legible. The date of death, 1936, sent a cold shiver through her spine. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Her heart pounded as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. A coincidence? A long-lost relative? It was possible, wasn't it? But the resemblance was more than just familial. It was identical. It was as if she had stepped into an old photograph of herself, frozen in time, a century apart. She reached into her pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out her phone. The camera shutter clicked as she took several photos of the grave, zooming in on the image, the inscription, the details. She needed proof. Needed to confirm that this was real when she was no longer standing in the eerie silence of Hollow Oak Cemetery. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around her feet. The air carried a strange stillness, as if the entire world had gone quiet just to observe this moment. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to step back from the grave. She needed answers. Emily glanced around, looking for anyone who might help her make sense of this. The cemetery was mostly empty, except for a distant figure near the caretaker's office. An old man, hunched and slow-moving, was arranging tools near a rusted wheelbarrow. Without hesitation, she hurried toward him, her sneakers crunching on the damp earth. "Excuse me, sir," she called, her voice slightly breathless. The old man turned slowly, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his gray eyes sharp despite his frail appearance. He tilted his head, as if surprised to see someone young wandering these grounds. "Yes?" he asked, his voice raspy but firm. Emily hesitated for a second, then held up her phone, showing him the picture of the gravestone. "Do you know anything about this grave? Eleanor Carter." The old man squinted at the screen before his gaze shifted toward the area where she had just been standing. His expression darkened slightly. "You found her grave." His voice had an odd weight to it, a tone that sent a prickle of unease down Emily's spine. "Yes." "Do you know who she was?" He sighed, wiping his hands on his worn-out overalls. "I've been the caretaker here for over 30 years. But Eleanor Carter's story, that goes back much further than my time." He paused, looking at her closely now. "Strange that you'd ask about her, though. No one's mentioned her name in years." Emily's fingers tightened around her phone. "Why is that?" The old man hesitated, then gestured toward a small bench near the office. "Maybe you should sit down. It's not a short story." Emily perched on the edge of the bench, anticipation mixing with dread. The old man settled beside her, his gaze distant as if he were sifting through the memories of others. "Eleanor Carter was a young woman, not much older than you, back in the 1930s. She lived in this town, came from a well-respected family. Smart girl, or so they said, but something happened to her. Something people stopped talking about after a while." Emily leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "They say she disappeared one night, just vanished. Her parents searched for her for weeks. The whole town did. No trace of her anywhere. And then a month later she turned up." Emily frowned. "She came back?" The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Her body did." A chill ran through Emily's veins. "They found her right where you found her grave today, but no one knew how she died. No signs of injury, no struggle. Just gone. The coroner couldn't explain it. Some people said she ran away and died in the woods. Others said she was murdered and the killer never got caught. But then There were the stories. Emily swallowed hard. What stories? The old man exhaled, his hands gripping his knees. People in town whispered that she wasn't really dead when they buried her. Her stomach twisted. What? He nodded slowly. They said she was found cold, lifeless, no heartbeat. But back in those days, medicine wasn't what it is now. Some believed she was in some kind of deep coma, mistaken for dead, that she woke up inside that coffin. That's why, years later, when her grave was disturbed by a storm, they found scratch marks on the inside of the lid. Emily felt nausea rise in her throat. But that's just an old tale, the old man added quickly, shaking his head. What is true is that people swore they saw her after she died, said she would appear at night, standing by the cemetery gates, or near the woods where she used to walk. Some say she was trying to get back home. Emily's skin prickled. She glanced back toward the grave, a new wave of unease washing over her. If Eleanor had really been buried alive, if her spirit had lingered for decades, why did she look exactly like her? The old man studied her carefully. Why are you asking about her anyway? Emily hesitated, debating whether to tell him. Then she took a deep breath. Because she looks exactly like me. The caretaker's face paled. For a moment, he just stared at her unblinking. Then he muttered something under his breath, something she couldn't quite catch. What did you say? She asked. He exhaled sharply. Nothing, child. Just be careful. Some things are best left alone. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. But she couldn't leave this alone. Not now. She thanked the old man and walked away, her mind racing. If Eleanor Carter had been buried alive, if people had truly seen her after death, then what did it mean that Emily looked exactly like her? She had to dig deeper. She had to know. But as she left the cemetery, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Emily left the cemetery that evening, but something inside her felt off. The air around her seemed heavier, as if the very atmosphere had changed since she laid eyes on Eleanor Carter's grave. She pulled her jacket tighter around her as she walked briskly back toward her apartment. The sky had darkened into a deep shade of indigo, the last remnants of daylight swallowed by thick clouds that moved unnaturally fast. The distant hum of the city felt miles away, as if she had stepped into a different world, one where time didn't quite move the same way. By the time she reached her small apartment, her mind was still racing. She threw her bag onto the kitchen counter, quickly pulling out her phone to check the photos she had taken at the cemetery. She zoomed in on the gravestone, on Eleanor's face, trying to find some logical explanation for why she looked identical to a woman who had died nearly a century ago. Just for a second, static lines ran across the display, distorting the image. Emily frowned, tapping the screen. The phone returned to normal. Probably just a software issue. She was overthinking things, right? She shook her head, pushing away the growing unease in her stomach. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Eleanor Carter was some distant relative, and the resemblance was just genetics. Maybe the old man at the cemetery was just feeding into urban legends. Maybe a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She walked cautiously toward the door, hesitating before peering through the peephole. No one was there. A chill crawled up her spine. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Get it together, Emily. She muttered to herself. Maybe it was just the wind or some neighbor passing by. She turned back toward the kitchen.
Knock, knock, knock.
Louder this time. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears. Again, she checked the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Something felt wrong. She hesitated before slowly unlocking the door and pulling it open just a crack. A gust of cold air rushed in, sending shivers down her spine. The corridor outside was dimly lit, stretching in both directions in eerie silence. There was no one in sight, but as she stepped back inside, something caught her eye. A single white flower lay on the floor just outside her door. A gardenia. Her throat tightened. She bent down, hesitating before picking it up. The petals were fresh, delicate, carrying a faint floral scent. Where had it come from? Who had left it there? She didn't know anyone who would do something like this. And then a sudden realization struck her. She had seen this flower before, in the photograph on Eleanor Carter's grave. A sudden chill crept up her spine as she stumbled backward, dropping the flower onto the floor. Trying to shake the unease from her mind, Emily forced herself to go about her evening as normally as possible. She turned on the lights in every room, double-checking the locks on her windows and door. After making a cup of tea, she sat on her couch, flipping absent-mindedly through old genealogy websites, looking for any trace of an Eleanor Carter in her family history. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed in the name, followed by the town. The page loaded, and a few historical records popped up. A birth certificate, a newspaper article about her disappearance, a death notice. But then, Emily's stomach clenched. She clicked on it, and the photo loaded in grainy black and white. It was another picture of Eleanor. She was standing in front of a mirror, looking directly at the camera. But there was something deeply unsettling about the image, because while Eleanor was facing forward, her reflection in the mirror was slightly off. The face in the glass wasn't perfectly aligned with the real one. It was tilted, watching her at an unnatural angle, almost as if. Emily slammed the laptop shut, her breath quick and shallow. And then, behind her, something moved. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, the sensation of someone standing just behind her. Her skin prickled as she slowly turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the dimly lit apartment. Nothing, but the room felt different, charged like static electricity before a storm. She stood up, trying to steady her breath. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she needed sleep. But as she turned toward her bedroom, her laptop screen flickered back on by itself. Her blood ran cold, and on the screen, where the old photograph had been a moment ago, was her own reflection. Except she wasn't moving. Her real body was frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at the screen, but the reflection was smiling. Emily gasped, stumbling backwards so fast that she knocked over the chair. The moment her body hit the floor, the screen went black again. Silence filled the room. She scrambled to her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. This wasn't just paranoia. Something was wrong. Something was watching her. The next few nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by vague, disjointed dreams. Visions of the cemetery, of Eleanor Carter standing at the foot of her bed, whispering words Emily couldn't understand. And every morning, when she woke up, another white flower lay on her nightstand. She locked her doors, changed her locks, even called the building manager to check the security cameras. But nothing ever showed up. No one entering or leaving her apartment at night. No sign of who or what was leaving the flowers. Then one night, she woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur in the dark. But as she lay frozen in bed, holding her breath, the whisper grew clearer. Emily, her heart nearly stopped. The voice was right next to her ear. She jolted up, fumbling for the lamp on her nightstand, and that's when she saw it. Standing at the foot of her bed, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, was a shadowy figure. A woman, Eleanor Carter. Her face was pale, her dark wavy hair cascading down her shoulders in soft, unnatural waves. Her expression wasn't angry or vengeful, just sad. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps. She flicked on every light in the apartment, searching every corner, every shadow. But she was alone. Or was she? Because when she turned back to her bed, her blood ran cold. There, resting on her pillow, was a single white flower. Emily was no longer sleeping at night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her, Eleanor Carter, standing at the foot of her bed, her presence lingering in the air long after she vanished. The white flowers kept appearing, sometimes on her nightstand, sometimes at her doorstep, sometimes inside locked drawers that no one else had access to. Something was terribly wrong. She spent hours digging through old archives, historical records, and forgotten newspaper clippings, piecing together fragments of a story that had been buried for nearly a century. And the more she uncovered, the more she realized Eleanor Carter's death had never been properly explained. The first major breakthrough came late one night, when she was combing through scanned copies of local newspapers from the 1930s. It was a small article, barely noticeable among the other news reports. Young woman found dead in Hollow Oak Cemetery. No signs of foul play, yet mystery remains. There was a grainy photograph accompanying the article. It was Eleanor, the same woman, the same face. Emily's face. Emily's fingers trembled as she scrolled further down the page, her eyes scanning the details. Eleanor had vanished for weeks before she was found, just like the old cemetery caretaker had told her. But there was something he hadn't mentioned. Eleanor wasn't the first. Beneath Eleanor's story in the small print was a reference to another case, a previous disappearance, nearly identical to Eleanor's. Another woman, found dead in the cemetery. No signs of injury, no cause of death, and Emily's stomach twisted as she stared at the image. It was another woman who looked exactly like her. Her hands shook as she clicked on more articles, tracing the pattern further and further back. Every few decades, a woman with her face had died under mysterious circumstances. Each time, the record said the same thing: no cause of death, no signs of trauma, and always found near Hollow Oak Cemetery. It was impossible, unreal, but it was happening. Emily's search became an obsession. She barely ate, barely slept, poring through records that no one had looked at in decades. She needed to know, who was she? And then she found it, deep in a genealogy database. Hidden in a scanned copy of an old, handwritten family tree was a name she wasn't expecting to see. Her own, Emily Carter. But the date next to it was wrong. It wasn't her birth date. It was from before she was born. Her hands clenched into fists, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't just a resemblance. This wasn't just genetics. This had happened before. Over and over again, Emily Carter was born, and Emily Carter died. Every few generations she came back, only to vanish. And now, it was her turn. That night, the whispers became louder. They followed her through the apartment, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling around her ears in a voice that sounded like her own but wasn't. She saw shadows move where there was no light. Doors creaked open on their own. And then, the worst of all, her own reflection no longer followed her movements. She had been brushing her teeth when she saw it. A small thing at first, just a delay, a fraction of a second where her reflection didn't turn away as quickly as she did. She blinked. The reflection smiled. She hadn't smiled. Her toothbrush clattered into the sink as she stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The reflection was still smiling. And then, slowly, it lifted its hand and pressed a single finger to its lips. A silent shh. Emily screamed. She spun away from the mirror, gasping for air, feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness flood through her. This wasn't just some nightmare. This was real. Something was trying to take her place. She ran from the bathroom, grabbing her car keys with shaking hands. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get out. But the moment she yanked open the front door, she was back in the cemetery. She gasped, stumbling backward, her eyes wide in disbelief. This wasn't possible. She had been inside her apartment. She had been running toward her car. And now, she was standing in front of Eleanor Carter's grave. A thick fog curled around the tombstones, the air heavy and still. The cemetery was silent, except for the faint whisper of wind through the trees. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Coming from behind her. She turned slowly, every muscle in her body tensed. There, standing in the fog, was Eleanor. Her expression was unreadable. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She was just waiting. Emily's throat was dry. "What do you want?" she whispered. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, and then, in a voice identical to Emily's, she spoke. "It's time." Emily took a step back. Time for what? Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand, pointing towards something behind Emily. Emily turned her head and saw her own grave. Her knees buckled. The tombstone was new, freshly carved. Her name was on it. Emily Carter. Born 1998, died 2024. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She spun back to Eleanor. "I'm not supposed to die," she choked out. "This isn't supposed to happen." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "It already has." Emily felt a sudden, crushing weight in her chest. The fog swirled around her, growing denser, suffocating. Her vision blurred. Her knees hit the ground, and the world around her faded to black. Emily's consciousness drifted between reality and something else. Something vast, dark, and endless. The weight in her chest grew heavier, pressing her down into an abyss where time didn't seem to exist. She wasn't sure she was dreaming or if she had crossed into something beyond the world she knew. And then she woke up, gasping. She shot upright, her lungs burning for air. The cemetery was gone. The fog, the tombstones, Eleanor, all of it had vanished. She was in her apartment. But something was wrong. The room looked the same, the furniture, the soft glow of her bedside lamp, the books stacked on her desk. But it felt different. The air was thicker, charged with something unseen. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, desperate to check the time, the date, anything to anchor herself back to reality. Her phone screen flickered to life. It was December 3rd, 1936. Emily's stomach dropped. She blinked, her pulse roaring in her ears. That wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of glitch. She rushed to her window, yanking the curtains aside. And the city outside wasn't her city anymore. The streets were different. No modern cars. No neon signs. The buildings looked older. The roads quieter. People in vintage clothing walked by, unaware of her presence. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Then she heard the voice. Emily. Slowly, she turned. Eleanor was standing in her doorway, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, as a living, breathing person. Emily's throat tightened. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This isn't happening." Eleanor's expression was calm. Too calm. "It is," she said softly. "And it always has been." Emily felt the walls of her reality cracking. "What is this?" she demanded. "What's happening to me?" Eleanor sighed, stepping closer. "You already know." Emily shook her head violently. "No, I don't." Eleanor's gaze softened. "Then let me show you." And before Emily could protest, the world around her shattered. Suddenly, she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was somewhere else. She saw flashes, glimpses of lives that weren't hers, but somehow were. A woman in 1902, standing before a mirror, adjusting her hat. Emily's face. A girl in 1865, laughing with her family on a farm. Emily's face. A woman in 1789, walking through the streets of a crumbling city. Emily's face. Over and over, throughout history, Emily had existed. And every time, she died the same way. At Hollow Oak Cemetery, Emily staggered back as the visions ended, gasping for breath. Eleanor stood before her, watching. "Now you understand." Emily's voice trembled. I've been reincarnated? Eleanor tilted her head. Not quite. Emily's skin prickled. Then what? Eleanor stepped closer, her expression unreadable. You are not reincarnated, Emily. You are the same person. Emily's breath hitched. That's impossible. Eleanor's gaze darkened. Is it? Emily shook her head. No. People don't just live multiple lives like this. Eleanor let out a slow breath. You never left. The room tilted. Emily felt her knees weaken. What do you mean? Eleanor's voice was quiet. You have always been here. Emily's mind spun, and then, suddenly, she remembered. The past flooded back. The disappearances, the deaths, the never-ending loop. She had died before. She had died many times. And she had always woken up again. Always the same face, the same name, the same fate. Her body shook violently as reality settled in. She was stuck in time. Every few decades, she was born again, not as a new person, but as herself. And every time, she was drawn back to Hollow Oak Cemetery. And every time, she died. A cycle that never ended. A trap. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. I've been trying to help you remember. Emily's chest tightened. Why me? Eleanor's expression softened. Because you were never supposed to be here. Emily's thoughts raced. What do you mean? Eleanor hesitated before speaking. You died once, Emily. A long time ago. And you were meant to move on. But something stopped that from happening. Emily swallowed. What? Eleanor's gaze darkened. Hollow Oak Cemetery. Emily's breath caught in her throat. That place isn't just a cemetery, Eleanor continued. It's a doorway, a place where time bends and where some souls get trapped. Emily's hand shook. You mean, I've been stuck here? For centuries. Eleanor nodded. Emily's head spun. This couldn't be real. And yet, it explained everything. The patterns, the deaths, the feeling that something had always been wrong. And then, Eleanor spoke the words that shattered the last of her reality. You have to break the cycle, Emily, or it will happen again. Emily's stomach dropped. But if you don't, you'll be back. Again, and again, forever. Her pulse pounded. How do I stop it? Eleanor's voice was calm. You have to do what you've never done before. Emily swallowed hard. What's that? Eleanor's eyes locked onto hers. You have to leave before it happens. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had to leave town. Leave before she died. Before she was trapped again. Before she became another forgotten grave in Hollow Oak Cemetery. Her chest tightened. Could she really escape? Or was it already too late? Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The weight of Eleanor's words pressed down on her like an anchor. You have to leave before it happens. But what if it was already too late? She could feel it. The pull. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, guiding her to Hollow Oak Cemetery like a thread woven through her very existence. She had ignored it before, chalking it up to coincidence, to curiosity. But now she knew the truth. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't curiosity. It was fate. And if she stayed, she would die. Again. Just like before. Just like every time before. Her hands trembled as she turned to Eleanor. What happens if I leave? Eleanor hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. You've never tried. Emily's throat tightened. She had never tried to leave. Because she had never remembered before. But now she did. Now, she had a choice. She could stay. She could let history repeat itself. Let the cycle continue. Or she could run. She didn't waste another second. She grabbed her coat, her keys, her phone, anything she could carry. She had no plan. No destination. She just needed to get out. The apartment felt wrong as she moved through it. The air thicker, heavier. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The hum of the city outside felt distant, detached. as if she were moving through a space that wasn't entirely real. Eleanor followed her to the door. "Don't stop," she warned. "No matter what happens, don't stop." Emily nodded. She yanked the door open and stepped into Hollow Oak Cemetery. Her heart stopped. No. She had left. She had walked out of her apartment. She had been escaping. How was she back here? Her breath came in ragged gasps. The tombstones stood silently around her, the fog swirling at her feet like living things. The air was cold, freezing. She could see her own breath curling in the dim light. And then, from behind her, footsteps. She turned and saw herself. No, not herself. Eleanor, or rather, what Eleanor had once been. The thing that had once been Emily. A hollow, empty reflection. A shadow of all the versions of her that had died before. The figure tilted its head, its mouth curving into a slow, cold smile. It's time. Emily ran. She didn't think. She didn't stop. She ran through the cemetery, past the tombstones that bore her name, past the statues that seemed to watch her, past the places she had died before. The pull was strong. It clawed at her chest, at her lungs, at her very bones. It was trying to drag her back, but she wouldn't let it. Not this time. She pushed harder, her legs burning, her breath ragged. The exit was ahead, the iron gates so close. And then the ground split beneath her feet. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The cemetery seemed to be shifting, warping, as if reality itself was unraveling. She turned, and Eleanor was there. No, not Eleanor. The shadow, the thing that had been waiting for her. It reached out a hand that was her own. "Come back," it whispered. Emily shook her head. No, not again. Never again. She pushed herself up, every muscle screaming in protest. The air clawed at her skin, the fog thickening, trying to drag her under. She reached the gates, and something grabbed her wrist. A cold grip, fingers that felt like stone, like the grave itself. She turned and saw herself, but not as she was now, as she had been before. The other versions, women with her face, women from the past, all of them pulling her back. She screamed, and then she made a choice, the only choice that mattered. She ripped herself free, and she ran through the gates. The moment she crossed the threshold, everything snapped. The air shifted, the ground stilled, the cold vanished. She turned back, and Hollow Oak Cemetery was gone. The gate was still there, the tombstones, the path, but it was different, quieter, smaller, like a normal cemetery, like nothing had ever happened. Her hands shook, her breath came in uneven gasps. She had made it. She had broken the cycle. She was free. She turned to look at Eleanor, but Eleanor was gone. Only a whisper remained in the wind. "Remember me." Emily closed her eyes, and for the first time in centuries, she was finally herself. Days passed. Emily didn't go back. She didn't need to. She felt lighter, whole, as if she had finally stepped into the life that was meant to be hers. One morning, she walked past a flower shop. A display outside caught her eye. White gardenias. She smiled and kept walking. For the first time, she was going somewhere new.